So first of all, AI is not going to replace you. AI is not that useful. AI, particularly these chatbots and these LLMs, is largely a hoax. It's going to pass. They are not capable of solving most of the tasks or being agentic or doing any of these kinds of things that we're being told by these software companies, most of whom are, I think, starting to admit that this is a fraud and that we are living in the middle of a bubble. The deeper problem is, however, the fact that people are so obsessed with AI shows you the loss of confidence people have in their own intelligence.
Mhm.
We're living at this moment where people feel so overwhelmed that they can't solve things. They're like, oh, I need something else to help me. That's not going to work. That will be the end of the human race. The moment where we give up on solving our own problems, it's over for us. And so the deeper thing there is we have to start collectively owning more of the problems that we're creating and coming up with new answers to them because we're the only ones that are going to make the future.
Well, guys, hello and welcome to another edition of Views from Underground. I'm here with Professor Angus Fletcher, and Professor Angus Fletcher is he's a professor of English I forget which university did you say?
I'm at the Ohio State University in the middle of nowhere.
Right. Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, I'm glad to have you on the show, Angus. And I'm reading your book at the moment, Intelligence, and it's an absolute breath of fresh air. It's a great read because in this age of AI, where everybody feels that they're losing their authenticity, where they feel they're losing that human touch, your book really taps into how somebody can maintain that element of themselves. Well, what do you mean by intelligence? What do you mean by that?
Primal intelligence is the ability to act smart with limited information, which is something that computers cannot do, but which is something that the human brain evolved to do because we evolved, the animal neuron did hundreds of millions of years ago in these very fast changing environments where information was thin and brittle. And so, how was it that you acted intelligently? You initiated a new action. You tried to do something and then you experienced, did it work? And if it worked, you kept doing it. And if it didn't work, you adapted it. And it's the way that for generations, children have grown up. It's how, almost all of us until the modern world learned to be. You went out, you experimented, you played, you saw it work, you saw it didn't work. It's the basis of theater. It's the basis of all of the arts. It's the basis of science. It's the basis of engineering. But in the modern world, somehow we've completely lost the plot and decided that computers are incredibly intelligent because they need huge amounts of information to make even the most basic decision. And you know what? There's almost no information about most things, and there is zero information about the future. So why do we think that AI is somehow gonna revolutionize things? It is, I think, ultimately both our responsibility and our challenge to own the problem of the future by accessing the intelligence within.
Hmm. Do you mean that no, well, I'm going to get into some of the stuff that you get into in the book, but what is your origin story? Where did you come from? What's your background of you?
Where did I come from? Yeah. So I originated in Cumbria in the north of England, and my family then moved to the United States. To skip through most of my childhood, went on and focused on neurophysiology at the University of Michigan at their medical school. And neurophysiology is literally the study of how individual neurons work. That's when I became fascinated with thinking about intelligence, not in the way that psychologists think of it, which is kind of a theory of mind approach, but a mechanism up approach, the way that you would understand a computer by looking at the hardware up and saying, hey, instead of trying to understand AI by looking at all the stuff on the screen, let me look at a logic gate. Let me understand both the power and the limits of a logic gate. I do the same thing with neurons. I say, what do neurons do? How do they think? One of the things that I decided working in that lab, which at the time made me a maverick, was that neurons think in actions, chains of actions are narratives. Therefore, human intelligence is fundamentally the ability to imagine stories. Stories are not, therefore, primarily for communicating. They're for thinking. They're how we make plans and plots and understand the mechanisms of the world. So, because I wanted to understand stories, I went off to Yale, got my PhD in Shakespeare, then went off, worked for a few years at Stanford, then at another school in California called the University of Southern California because I started getting connected with Hollywood and things like that. And Then finally, I got recruited to join Project Narrative at the University of at Ohio State University, where I am now. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've worked with U.S. Army Special Operations to start to focus on this ability that neurons have, the computers don't have, this ability to initiate actions, to create new stories, to create new narratives, and to see how they can be used in these volatile environments that special operators face every day to help them plan faster, adapt faster, and win the day.
So you work with special operations? Do you work overseas or do you work in America with them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so first of all, I have actually had the opportunity to work with some overseas special operations units. So SAS units, just kind of a little bit, Canada, JTF2, and also the Aussies and the Kiwis done a little bit of work. But that's all been under the aegis of U.S. Army Special Operations, which has made all those connections for me. And that's been in sort of partner relations. But most of what I do is I go onto training sites. So I don't jump out of helicopters in war zones with the brain scanner. That would both be, a hard on the brain scanner and would also result, I'm sure, in my immediate death. So the Army has very wisely kept me out of battle zones. But what I do is I go into these training sites, and the goal of these training sites is to take essentially civilians, so 18, 19, 20-year-olds off the street, and turn them into special operators. And to do that by simulating combat environments up to the threshold that these young brains can really start to process it, but in a positive way, so that instead of getting battle fatigue or shock or PTS or something like that, they instead are able to kind of absorb and grow from the experience. And so the U.S. Army has developed these incredible training pipelines. And basically the way they all work, they're secret, they're not classified, if that distinction makes sense. So, in theory, I could talk about them, but I generally try not to talk about them because if you reveal the secrets, it kind of, damages what's special about them. But generally what happens is you're given a brief, you're given a plan, you're told, here's what you got to do. You move into an environment as a trainee, as a recruit, and then immediately, boom, your plan gets broken. Then you have to figure out how to adapt. Boom, your adaptation gets broken, and again and again and again. And the Army likes to call it role playing with real bullets. So it's
Hmm.
essentially almost like a giant theater game, except that you're getting shot at. And those are the environments that I got to work in, got to train, and I got to see how the Army was really effective at developing these processes of primal intelligence, being smart in low information environments. And then we took that research and we started putting it into American public schools and showing that it also worked for regular people.
Hmm. Wow. You mentioned as well plans when you're making plans, especially with the special operations. How does that work? Why are plans so important?
Plans are intelligence, and plans are what computers can't do. So for the last 40, 50 years, if you look at almost any handbook to intelligence, whether it comes out of behavioral economics or psychology or whatever, the focus is always on decision making. It's always like, if you're going to be a smart person, you got to make the right decision. That is actually incorrect. Because you can only make the right decision if you happen to be handed an option which is the right one. What happens if all the options you're given, as is almost always the case in life, are not the right option? What do? You have to invent a new one. That's actually what intelligence is. Intelligence is being able to come up with a new option, a new plan, a new direction. Computers can pick from existing options based on data, but only you as a human can make a new option. Only you as a human can make a new plan. And as I've sort of intimated, another word for new plan is a new plot, is a new story. So to be a human is to constantly be imagining new stories of the future and then imagining the steps to make those stories real. So to a certain extent, every one of us is simultaneously a special operator and also Shakespeare, because what Shakespeare and special operators have in common is they're able to imagine new stories that work.
Hmm. Yeah, I heard you mention Shakespeare as King Lear and Hamlet. Actually, the only two plays by Shakespeare I've ever read, and yeah, yeah, and but good plays nevertheless. Oh, Macbeth as well, of course, the tragedies. I've just read the tragedies or Macbeth when I was a teenager. But you okay? So going back to making new plans and where does that come from? Does that come from intuition? Does it come from emotion? Does it come from like I know you mentioned before, you mentioned intuition, emotion, common sense, and the other one is please remind.
There's intuition, imagination, common sense, and emotion. So
Yeah.
so those are the four primal powers. So basically, the way this works is When I started to work with U.S. Army Special Operations, I started to notice that they were really effective and good at training, but they didn't really have a way of explaining this to ordinary people like me. And so we sort of had to break it down and make it simple. And the way that we broke it down and made it simple was we realized that there were four basic primal powers that these special operators had. So the first was intuition, and the intuition is your ability to spot exceptions. It's your ability to spot opportunities or emergent threats in your environment. And the human brain is really, really good at this because the human brain evolved in these environments where things were always changing. But it's been taken away from us because in the modern world, we're taught that intuition is pattern matching.
Hmm.
We're taught this by economists, by people like Daniel Kahneman, and you can only have a pattern if you've seen at least three instances of something. And that's by the time you've seen three instances of something, you're already dead if it's a threat. So actually, intuition is the ability to spot it the first time. So that's the beginning of a new plan, is your realization, oh, there's an opportunity here that I can
Hmm.
seize, or there's a problem I've got to act on. Imagination is your ability to take that exception and branch it into multiple possible paths of action. So
Hmm.
you know you've got an effective imagination if you can see five or six or eight different things to do in any situation. If you're not
Hmm.
locked in on, I've got to do this thing to make it work, you're like, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. That's a sign that your imagination is functioning. So
Hmm.
you've got your intuition up, you're spotting opportunities, you've got your imagination going, you're seeing all these different paths through life. The next question is, which of those paths do you take? And so what common sense does is common sense helps you match your plan to your situation. It says,
Hmm.
this is the plan that's most likely to work in this situation. How does it do that? Does it do it by thinking probabilistically like a computer? No, it does not. Instead, what it does is it matches the novelty of your plan to the novelty of your environment. So basically, the simple way of thinking about that is if you're in a familiar situation, just do something that worked in the past, right? Why
Hmm.
reinvent the wheel? But if you're in a highly volatile situation where everything is changing, you yourself have to speed up your innovation to meet the novelty of the times. And
Hmm.
that's important because most people today do the opposite. Most people today, when they're confronted by volatility, they go backwards and get conservative. And they're like, oh, you know what? We should do what works in the past. That's why you're
Hmm.
seeing, political parties now, all of them are going back into their old toolkits, being like,
Yeah.
oh, we should try this thing again. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. We've got to have new ideas. That's the only way to survive in this volatile landscape. And also, most people take their biggest chances, take their biggest risks when they feel comfortable because they're like, you know what, I'm bored. So I'm just going to use this opportunity now to take a chance. And that's also not common sense. Common sense is if things are predictable, if they're boring, that's great. Just keep doing what you're doing. The final power, emotion, we've already talked about how you initiate plans, how you multiply your plans, and how you pick the right plan for your environment. But there's also the question of what's the right plan for you?
Hmm.
Because you can be really successful in this world and not feel fulfilled. You can make lots of money or, sort of triumph at all of the games that you're playing, but feel dissociated or alienated from your own personal sense of purpose. And that's because each of us has our own story inside us.
Hmm.
And emotion helps you figure out which of these possible paths is closest to your own narrative so that as you're living organically to who you are, your own, what we would call a narrative character, your own character. Are you living the life that you personally were meant to lead? So those are the four primal powers: intuition, emotion, common sense, and imagination.
Hmm. So in order to tap into one's own character, one's own unique personality, you would lean more on common sense. Is that what you said?
Emotion,
Emotion,
emotion.
excuse me.
Yeah.
So intuition, let's say I'm going about my day, if something comes up and I have an intuitive feeling, right? And you said that you go with the first one rather than the third or fourth one. Maybe you have three or four different intuitive feelings. Are you suggesting that you go with the first intuitive feeling you have, or the first, or do you just use then common sense to pick whichever one you okay, right, I
Yes.
got it.
You use common
So,
sense. Yeah.
so emotion is something is like an afterthought. It's something that you does it feel right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so emotion, it sort of depends on where you are in life, right? So I think when you're just getting started, common sense is probably more important than emotion because you need to survive more than you
Hmm.
need to find your own path. When you're just trying to find your footing in this world, you want to make the common sense decision. But then the
Hmm.
more you start being successful, the more you can start to say, okay, but what do I want? What's right for me? So in general, I would say that emotion would kind of click in after common sense. In my own case, it turns out that I have terrible common sense. And my life has been driven almost entirely by emotion, which is why I've had such a weird maverick existence. So if you happen to be someone like me, you can survive. But in general,
Mhm.
obviously, it's more commonsensical to go with common sense.
Is there a difference between men and women? Do women tend to go with more with emotion more than men, or does men go more with common sense? What is there any difference there? Or does it matter?
No, there's no difference. And the thing that we emphasize in the book is that we want to start thinking in terms of categories like men and women because that's how computers think. Computers think in
Hmm.
terms of binaries and labels. And the more you start thinking like that, the more you're already making a judgment before you've actually done anything. And that's preventing you from seeing opportunities. So
Hmm.
if you're trying to live probabilistically, then you want to think in terms of, man, woman, tall, short, that kind of a thing. But when you
Hmm.
start working with special operators, what you start to realize is that the people you would expect to be special operators are actually not special operators. Like you have this idea in your mind of what a special operator is, but actually, special operators defy all those expectations. And in general, when you look at really successful people, they just break the rules.
Hmm. For example, can you give me an example of that? How they would defy the expectations, a special operator?
Yeah. So, for example, in my mind, when I was introduced to the teams, I assumed that special operators would be maybe about 6'2", 6'4", really big, really strong, really fast. A lot of special operators are tiny. There's a lot of really tiny special, they're not huge. There's also a lot of incredibly thin special operators. One of the things that's been funny for me is I am the furthest person from a special operator. Like you would never want to hand me a firearm. You'd never want to throw me out of a helicopter, any of those kinds of things. But anytime I walk anywhere in the army, because I work with special operators, they just assume that I must be a special operator. And, if you looked at me in the civilian world, people would think, oh, that guy's too skinny. He's too scrawny to be a special operator. But inside the special operations community, there's people that are skinnier than me. So there's not really any, special operators are intelligent in surprising ways. Like a lot of them, might not be good at, traditional school, but are brilliant. And so the main thing there is that we live in this world that's focused on efficiency. How do you make a system efficient? How do you build an efficient machine? You label things, you tag them, and that allows you to kind of just throw stuff away and say, oh, it's more efficient to focus on this stuff. But how do you build a human system? You don't focus on efficiency. You focus on effectiveness, and you develop effectiveness by treating people as individuals as opposed to archetypes.
Hmm. I heard you giving an example of when the child, and this I could have totally identify with this because the exact same thing happened to me with my son when he was eating a yogurt with a spoon and he dropped the spoon, okay? And I went and I got another spoon and he didn't want that. The exact same thing happened to me. And not just one time, or it happened to me two or three times. Drop the spoon. He wants the spoon that is dropped. He doesn't want the exact same spoon that I just got from the kitchen that's clean. He wants the one on the ground, and I have to go and wash that. And I bring it back to him and I gave it to him. However, two or three times later, I explained to him, I said, look, they're the exact same. There's no difference. And once he computed that, once he understood that, uh, it was no problem. He took the spoon. Can you explain that, Angelo? Can you explain that scenario, please?
Yeah, so your son transitioned into adulthood there is what happened to your son when you made that explanation. So the basic story that you're talking about is something that happened to me that I'm sure has happened to other parents is that you're feeding your kid with a spoon. The kid throws the spoon on the ground. You try and get them a new spoon. They don't want the new spoon. They want the spoon that was thrown on the ground. Why is that? Well, because kids from the moment of birth think that every individual object is special.
Hmm.
They don't think in this sort of abstract sense that a spoon is a spoon is a spoon is a spoon. They think that is a specific, special spoon. And that power is what allows kids to grow so rapidly because they're always open to things. They never assume that they've seen something before. They think that every situation is special and unique, and they're always treating it as though it's special and unique. And there have been actually some studies here that we've done at Ohio State where we've shown that children are much better at noticing mutants, for example, than adults are because they spend that extra bit of time just to look and see the whole animal, whereas
Hmm.
adults just quickly categorize, quickly categorize, quickly categorize. So as a child, you're focused on what's special, what's unique, what's individual. As you become an adult, you instead are focused more on productivity and efficiency and speed. And what you then start to do there is you start to put stuff into categories and types. And you start to use this logic part of your brain, the computer part of your brain, to move through your day faster so that you're not always being like, I need my special spoon. I can use any spoon. And as I point out in the book, that adult setting has a lot of advantages in a lot of settings, right? It would be ridiculous if we as adults thought that every mass-produced spoon was different, right? No,
Hmm.
they're the same. So there are advantages to that. But if you can't turn off that adult setting and go back to your child brain, then what ends up happening is you start treating everything in life as though it is not unique. And
Hmm.
anytime you see something that's weird, you regress it to the mean, you skip over it, you judge it as weird and, not something that you're interested in. And so you stop yourself from growing. So the key to growth, the key to discovery is curiosity. Curiosity comes from treating something as special. That's the child brain. That's why the child thinks that, each spoon is unique. As the adult, we lose curiosity in order to become faster, more efficient, which is great, except if we can't turn our child brain back on, in which case we as the adult are doomed just to keep following the same path until the world has changed so much that it wipes us out.
Hmm. Is this what you mean when you're looking for exceptions in life? To
Yes.
so how would one look for an exception in their daily life? Or is it a matter of looking in their daily life or just in general?
Yeah. So the more that you can see exceptions, the more you're activating your intuition. The US Army Special Operations, they refer to exceptions as exceptional information. So they have this big fancy word for it. And to your point, you have to get good at spotting exceptional information. If you're an operator, you've got to reactivate that child part of your brain. So how do special operations do it? Well, the most basic thing they do is they focus on activating your ability to see what's unique about other people.
Hmm.
Because most of what the human brain is good at is actually interacting with other people. The human brain's pretty dumb about the world, but it's pretty smart about other brains. And so, one of the things that special operators do is they play this game called Delay the Why. And in Delay the Why, you ask the other person who, what, when, where, how about their life, but you never ask them why. Because the moment you ask why, judgment has been made and curiosity has ended. And so when you watch operators play this game, it's pretty remarkable how much information they can surface. And, they'll say something like, oh, I love kayaking. And they'll be like, oh, okay, well, who do you go kayaking with? And like, well, I go with everybody except for my wife. And then immediately you want to ask, well, why don't you go with your wife? But you can't ask that, right? So you got to say, well, what else do you do with your wife? Or, blah, 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 right? And then you see what happens is you start opening up, opening up, opening up, and then you start to really discover stuff that you wouldn't have discovered otherwise. It starts to surprise you. And anytime you experience a surprise, that's your brain saying, I've hit an exception to a mental rule because I wouldn't be surprised
Hmm.
if it wasn't an exception. So the more you can practice that with people, the more you develop that sense of surprise. Other simple things, reading near-term science fiction, going to look at art. These are all things which kind of wake up that part of your brain. And the best thing actually is travel. So if you can like
Hmm.
really travel and put down your phone and really immerse yourself in another culture, that'll start to pop all these parts of your brain. You'll go back to your regular life and you'll see it totally anew.
Hmm. You also mentioned when you come across somebody and when you're about to become friends with somebody, or a great precursor to becoming friends with somebody is when you understand that person, when you see the exception in that person, when you see something, when the person is telling you their story and you're like, oh, really? Right, that's interesting. And that develops friendship more. Do I have that right?
That's completely correct. Yeah, I mean, all of your basic bonding experiences are that sense of discovery,
Hmm.
that sense of, wow, like I'm discovering something new. I mean, that's also, of course, the basis of a good romantic relationship is you're like, I feel like I found something that I never would have found in this world. You're surprised. And then also in a good conversation, you're not just discovering things about the other person, you're discovering things about yourself. Because what
Hmm.
happens is by that person listening to you, it starts to surface surprises that you hadn't realized about your own story. And that's when you start servicing your stories together, your stories can start to link together. And that's when you develop a common story, right? Your common narrative. And that common narrative, the more that it has those special pieces in it, the more that it feels like, your favorite novel or your favorite comic book or whatever. And that it's just filled with these extraordinary details that just make you want to go back and read it again and again.
Yeah, you mentioned also Van Gogh. Why is Van Gogh important to you? Why I think he's under the category of intuition. Am I right?
Yeah, he's under the category of intuition. Yeah, and
Well,
Van Gogh, well, I mean, I think Van Gogh is generally important because Van Gogh invented modern art essentially. I mean, he is, and has been for a long time just the most extraordinary story of someone who was so far ahead of his time that he dies essentially penniless. And now you can find Van Gogh posters in pretty much any college dormitory in the United States. He's become so ubiquitous. Like, what is it? And so the question is like, if intuition is what allows you to see these exceptions, and those exceptions are hinting at possibilities that can become the future, if you have a high power of intuition, you're able to spot the future faster. And so Van Gogh clearly did that. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to go and I wanted to understand what it was that was kind of activating, that was popping in Van Gogh's mind. And as I sort of talk about in some detail in the book, and we unfortunately can't illustrate here because I don't have any cool slides with like Van Gogh paintings. But basically Van Gogh was really attuned to color. And in particular, he was attuned to the way that if you put two different colors together, it intensified those colors. And that led him to overturn the reigning color theory of his time, which was, the red, yellow, blue theory, and replace it with RGB. And it led him to paint this astonishing self-portrait, which was the final self-portrait he painted his life. You can see it. He has a kind of cyan suit on and this kind of orangey red beard. And it turns out that orangey red and that cyan is the most powerful color contrast the human eye can experience. And it was something that was totally undiscovered by artists prior to Van Gogh. So that's just a little example of what happens if
Mhm.
you're able to spot exceptions is you're able to see this thing, which is so obvious. I mean, literally, it's color. It's the thing that almost all of us are confronted with every time we open our eyes. But we had all been conditioned by art theory to think, oh, color follows these patterns. And so it took somebody who was able to trust himself and go his own way to find modern art.
Mhm. So how would he have used the imagination there? Like if he had that if he had that intuitive feeling about color, are you saying that he used his imagination to see different possibilities into the future, and he just picked with one of them? He went with one of them and created his masterpieces. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, so imagination is the ability to kind of multiply these possibilities. And what you see
Hmm.
with Van Gogh is in the last year of his life, he painted dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings, and many of them are very similar to other paintings, and he's just exploring these different possibilities of how to use these colors. And
Hmm.
more specifically with Van Gogh, he came up with three big color contrasts.
Hmm.
There's the blue and the yellow. There's the sort of cyan and the red, which I've already talked about. And then there's the green and kind of the lavender. And you'll see these in different kind of paintings that he painted over the last couple years of his life. And
Hmm.
he was just focused on exploring those possibilities with his imagination and seeing how far he could push them and in what ways he could play with them. And I wouldn't say that Van Gogh is someone that I would characterize as having a high degree of common sense. So
Hmm.
he never ever, produced, for example, an advertisement for cigarettes or something, which I imagine would have made him very wealthy or whatever else he was doing at the time. But he did have a high emotion score in the sense that he was really committed to his own art, even though nobody else believed in him. And so you can certainly see that kind of other primal power at work in his paintings.
Hmm. Angus, what do you think of Beethoven? Where would he fall in this category? Or
Yeah, well, I talk about Beethoven in the book, so I want to be honest with your audiences. I'm not a classical music scholar, and to my surprise, I was introduced to Beethoven by United States Army Special Operations because I asked them, what is it that makes a good plan? And what they said
Mhm.
to me, well, a good plan has a single long-term focus, but is very flexible in the short term. So they describe it as many paths up a single mountain, and they say that's when you know you've got a good plan. And they say that most people plan the opposite of that. So most people try and, do all these different things with their lives, but are always trying to do them the same way, using the one skill that they've developed in their life. So instead of having kind of a single defined strategy and multiple tactics, they have a single tactic and multiple strategies, which is a disaster. So anyway, special operations explained all this to me, and then I said to them, "Hey, like, where did you guys learn this from? Who helped you develop planning?" And one of the folks they told me was Beethoven. And the reason for that is because Beethoven has these sort of long, overarching song structures, but all this kind of remarkable improvisation in the middle. And so you get this same sense of a single strategic kind of arc when you're listening, but also all this kind of possibility in the short term to try different things.
Mhm. What is the dichotomy between why and what if? In imagination? How do they work? For example, where if I'm using my imagination, how should I look at that question why and the other question what if? Where do they fall in that place?
Yeah. So So maybe what I should do here is say that most of human intelligence is either thinking why or thinking what if. So coming up with an explanation for things and then coming up with new things that you can do. These are both narrative.
Hmm.
And the way they come to be in the brain is that in the brain, story runs middle, beginning, end. So it doesn't
Hmm.
run beginning, middle, end. It runs middle, beginning, end. And
Hmm.
that's because as a human, you walk through the world, something surprises you. When it surprises you, you suddenly realize you've walked into the middle of a story that you don't understand. You say, where did this come from? So you jump backwards and you ask, why? Why is this happening? And then once you've got that why, you jump forward to the end and you say, where's this going? In other words, what if? So this is the constant process that the human brain is always undergoing. It's walking through the world, being surprised, asking why, then imagining what if. So the backwards jump is the why, the forward jump is the what if. How'd you get better at that? Well, the way you get better at that is you start practicing coming up with multiple whys. Because it turns out that if you ask most people why something happened, they'll just jump to their preferred explanation. And if you ask a computer, it'll come up with the most probable explanation. So there's this tendency in the modern world to converge on a single why. Operators and people who have high degrees of imagination are able to come up with multiple explanations for why any event could happen. And you should challenge yourself to do this in your personal relationships. If someone is irritating you, right, come up with another explanation for why they might be doing it, and then another explanation. And the more you do this, the more your brain will start to open to that person and start to think, oh, okay, maybe there's some more possibilities here. So you want to multiply whys. And then when it comes to what if thinking, you want to get more precise and specific with it. Because what we see with a lot of people is when they imagine the future, they jump years into the future to some abstract goal. So they say, oh, I'm going to be an influencer, or oh, I'm going to write a best-selling novel, or I'm going to start a company that uses AI to transform everything, and they haven't spelled out every single little step in that. And so what we encourage people to do, which is what special operators do when they're making plans. They literally mark out every single step. Or what a TV writer does when they're writing a show, which they figure out how does every single beat link together to get me to that large goal. And so that's how you start to sharpen what if. So multiply why, sharpen what if.
Hmm. What is story, Angus? What is like we all have our own life stories, I guess, but what is story? How should we look at story in relation to our own lives?
Yeah, so very basically, independent of human life, story is just a sequence of events.
Hmm.
It's one action that causes another action. Because our brain thinks in story, and why does our brain think in story? Well, our brain thinks in story because action is what rules the world. It's not
Hmm.
ideas that rule the world. It's not math that rules the world. It's action. You got to act faster, and you've got to act in a way that surprises your opponent. That's what wins life. It's about action. So your brain evolved to think in action. It evolved to think in these chains of actions, which are stories. And so naturally it thinks about itself as a chain of actions. It thinks about itself as a story. You spend most of your free time either reflecting on stuff that has happened to you over the course of the day or imagining things you might do in the future. This is what the
Hmm.
brain is always doing. It's always retelling the past to itself or imagining the future. When you get into a
Hmm.
conversation with somebody, the same thing happens. So the point of this is not, that the brain thinks in story. The question is, what should your life story be?
Hmm.
And on a certain level, everyone's life story is unique and individual because their brains are all unique and individual and their circumstances are all unique and individual. But when
Hmm.
we looked at special operators who were particularly successful, and by successful, we meant that they had something called anti-fragility. And anti-fragility was basically the ability to gain wisdom and strength from setbacks, and also the ability to achieve more of your life goals faster than other people. When we looked at people who had anti-fragility, what we found is that in terms of their life story, their past was integrated. So when we look at people who have anti-fragility, what we see is that they have this integrated past and a branching future. And what that means is that they're able to look back over their past at every single thing that happened to them and explain it with a single why. They're able to come up with one why for why all of these things occurred. And when they look forward to their future is branching, which is they're able to think of many what ifs, many different possible paths that they could go. And the reason that this is so effective is what it means is that because you've got that integrated past, that's your momentum that you're carrying from the past. It's like the water in a stream, it's pushing you forward in a single direction. And so if you hit a rock, Even if that rock deflects you momentarily, you're going to go back into your path afterwards. So that's giving you a constant sense of direction. And the branching future, what that's giving you is adaptability, flexibility in the moment, in the short term. So you're able to very quickly react and shift. So that's what we saw in terms of people's life narrative. But I do want to remind everyone that ultimately your life narrative is totally unique. I mean, it really is. I've worked with, I mean, I think at this point, maybe tens of thousands of people. I've never encountered two people who had the same life story.
Mm. Wow. Do you know that Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, his quote, life can only be understood by looking backwards. Do you think there's a lot of truth in that?
Well, in Hamlet, to talk about Shakespeare, he talks pretty famously about how, you're a crab, which is essentially you walk forward by looking backwards. And I think that's actually where Kierkegaard was inspired to get that from.
Mm.
So yeah, I think, you as a human, you gain a lot of knowledge from looking backwards because in a way, that's what you're most certain about, The future is the great unknown. At the same time, I would say that you do need to spend at least a little bit of time thinking about the future because that's what allows you to kind of, develop the strategies and plans going forward.
Mhm. You mentioned about why and why we shouldn't ask why in the category of questions like who, what, where, when. Why it's like the Socratic method, and Socrates really put an emphasis on rationality and being on logic, being logical. Of course, Aristotle was influenced by Socrates then. What do you think of that? Because in the West here, we put so much emphasis on that, on being logical all the time. Logic is the answer. If you want something, you have to be very logical about it. But what you're saying is the opposite. No, you have to. Logic has its limitations. It's like one of my favorite books is a book by Nietzsche, Twilight of the Idols, and in that he really goes to town on Socrates, showing Socrates' limitations in logic and rationality. What do you think of that? Is
Yeah,
it
of course. Well, the limits of logic have been repeatedly demonstrated. So, first of all, what happened in the Middle Ages was that everyone thought logically. This was what they did in all the universities, is they all taught Aristotle. And what great advances were made in the Middle Ages? None. That's why the Renaissance happened. So the first time that logic was blown up was when that happened. The next time logic was blown up, to your point, is in the late 19th century with Nietzsche and the critique of this Enlightenment revival of logic, and Nietzsche sort of pointing out all these problems with logic. And then, logic came back again in the 20th century with the computer. And
Mhm.
everyone's like, oh, because a computer thinks in pure logic. Literally, the logic functions that were designed by Aristotle for the syllogism and or not are the entirety of how a computer thinks. It's the formalization and mechanization of that Aristotelian symbolic logic. So the computer comes around, and then everyone starts worshiping the computer and saying, "Oh my goodness, computers are so smart." Computers
Mhm.
are not smart because computers run on data, and data does one thing, which is perfectly predict yesterday. That is the value of a computer. That can be great if you're in an environment where nothing is changing. That can be very useful. But 99% of life is about change, and that's because we are biological creatures.
Mhm.
We are not logical, we are biological. And biology is about growth, conflict, contestation, evolution, all of these things. And none of those can be fathomed by logic. The
Mhm.
most famous attempt to fathom growth by logic is by a philosopher called Hegel, who I'm sure you've read.
Yeah.
And Hegel comes up with this incredibly complicated theory, which basically boils down to everything has a telos, because everything goes thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There is no telos. Darwin disproved this. After Darwin, Hegelianism is dead. People, I think, in certain parts of the world have a hard time waking up to this. Logic is very comforting to a lot of people. It's certainly become something that we've been saturated with because of the modern computer. But yeah, you do a lot better doing like a special operator. Instead of trusting in logic, trust in your imagination.
As a story scientist, Angus, where do you see the role of AI? Where do you see the role of ChatGPT? For example, I sometimes have put into ChatGPT, write me a story about whatever, a hedgehog going across the road, whatever. And it'll write me the story. And the story, even though it's written quite well, and you can get it to write it in even any style, like in the style of Jack Kerouac or Shakespeare, whatever you want, and it will read quite well, but yet there's something missing when you read it. There's something that it doesn't carry that, I guess that that human touch, that human,
No, no,
you
it's more than human touch. Okay, so here's the thing. Computers do not think in narrative. They're incapable of thinking in narrative. The only reason they're able to produce these sort of simulated narratives is because they're regurgitating word patterns. So they're
Mhm,
basically taking a human story, they're matching the words from it, and then they're moving those words. When you
mhm,
are doing that, you're producing a photocopy, essentially of something else without understanding the underlying mechanisms that move it. So there's this huge loss. And the main thing that's lost is what is the purpose of a story? The purpose of a story is to create suspense. It's to create interest because as you're reading a story, what you're always thinking is what is going to happen. That is the only reason that you read a story. And computers have no ability to think in suspense because they exist in the mathematical present. There is no suspense in the mathematical present. Everything is always the same in the mathematical present, right? So because they don't understand suspense, they can't create narrative. They can't craft and get better at understanding how stories work. They can only photocopy and Xerox existing word patterns and kind of mimic stories. So that's what you're missing. It's not something that's uniquely human. It's
mhm,
actually narrative. They're actually missing the story. They've replaced the story with words.
mhm,
And that's not the same as a story. And because of that, they also can't invent new stories. So, computers, the more stories you feed them, the more that they can produce these kinds of, photocopies and sort of
mhm,
mashups and blends of these stories. But they can never do what a human does, which is sit down and imagine a new story. And because they can't imagine a new story, they can't imagine a new plot, they can't imagine a new plan, which is why they're useless at innovating, and which is why they're never going to take over the world or do anything interesting. So, I mean, I think we have wasted so much of our time, and so much of our time has been wasted by these sort of, toys, frankly.
mhm,
There is legitimate AI, standard AI developed by software engineers for specific local applications. It's very boring. No one's interested in it. It can be very useful. But, these chatbots, total waste of time, not intelligent. The more you use them, the more you are essentially depleting your own intelligence.
mhm. Yeah, I try to write. I write longhand. I will write like 500 words a day, just longhand, just for that connection. And I don't. I try to write on the computer. It never works. I don't feel the same. I can get something down, but it never feels the same. When I write longhand, what I usually do then is my voice notes. I will record myself. I will record what I wrote down on my voice notes, and then that will try. You can put the transcript and just copy it then into a Word file. But that longhand, for some reason, for that half an
It's
hour, it
it's
just.
not for some reason. Let me explain it to you. So we saw the same thing with special operators, and I found it totally fascinating, is that they will do all of their planning on chalkboards.
Mhm,
They'll actually write out their plans in longhand on a chalkboard. And this was really surprising to me because if you go into other areas of the military, they'll do it on PowerPoint. They'll put up a PowerPoint slide, they'll type it. But in special operations, they always write it with chalk. And they say when we write it out with chalk, it just works better. We don't know why. Well, the reason it works better is because when you're using your hand, you're activating your motor cortex. And when
okay.
you're activating your motor cortex, that's what generates action. That's what generates plans. That's what generates stories. So what you're doing there is you're engaging the whole biological process that your brain is supposed to be doing when it's engaged in planning, when it's engaged in thinking by using your hand. And when you're typing, you're activating only a tiny fraction of that. And so, yes, it is much better to write notes out by hand. You'll remember them much better. It's much better to make plans by hand. Those plans will be much more imaginative.
Mhm. When you say about narrative as well, that AI can't write narrative. Yet, what about plots? Like, for example, the 8 arc, right? If you put in like status, trigger, quest, surprise, critical, if you give them the plot line, it will actually go with that plot line. Now, again, there's something missing. What do you mean by narrative? Do you mean like what Samuel Beckett might meant by like there's
No, no,
no
no,
pl
no, no. I mean basic narrative. So what's happening? First of all of these systems have been hand coded by engineers to
Mhm,
include all of these sort of architectures in them. So anytime that one of these systems appears to be following these narrative commands, that's because a human has gone in there and hardwired essentially a little structure in there. And
mhm,
so the first thing to know is that these systems cannot teach themselves those structures by themselves. They have to be hand wired in there by humans. If they have to be hand wired in there by humans, what that means is that the system itself can never come up with anything new or original that is a plot. It can
Hmm.
only essentially wrap new words over these existing architectures. And so, it can kind of change the way that something looks, but not the way that it functions. That would be
Hmm.
basically like saying it can't invent a new car, but it can paint a car a different color, as many different colors as you want. That's useless. You wouldn't want that. And so, I've got a lot of published academic work on this. It would just be incredibly boring and tedious for your audience to hear. But you know, computers cannot think causally. They cannot think counterfactually. They cannot engage in these narrative processes because they think in equations.
Hmm.
And in an equation, A happens at the same time as B.
Hmm.
In a narrative, A occurs before B because A is the cause and B is the effect. A
Hmm.
cause and an effect do not occur at the same time in a narrative, but in a computer's brain they do. And that's why a computer thinks not only that fire causes smoke, but that smoke causes fire, unless you hardwire it to think otherwise. So they're just completely incompetent at understanding narratives, at processing narratives, at generating narratives. All that's happening is there's a kind of elaborate magic trick that these companies are using to try and basically con you into thinking
Hmm.
the systems are smarter than they are so that they can grift and get some of your cash. But it's
Hmm.
not worth it.
Yeah, like everything is saturated in it now. You go in emails, for example. Every email that I get, it just stinks of AI. You can tell it straight away. It's
Yeah.
because it's saturated so much that it's kind of like drowning out the good stuff. You really have to know where to look if you're looking for something unique and authentic.
Yeah, so it can't do originality and it also can't be incisive. It
Hmm.
can't get to the point. It just bloviates. So
Hmm.
anytime you open an email and it's like, there are 3 points that I want you to consider, you're like, oh my God, it's an AI, right? Like as a human, you never say there are 3 points I want you to consider. You get to the point. And you use
Hmm.
as few words as possible because it takes you energy to write words, whereas it takes no energy for a computer to emit words. So it just basically vomits huge amounts of syntax everywhere. And then it's exhausting for you as a reader. I actually think the most antisocial thing you can do is use AI and then send that to somebody else. I mean, that's
Hmm.
basically a crime against your fellow humans because you're forcing them to waste their intelligence to compensate for your laziness and the computer's stupidity. So, yes, I'm not a fan of AI emails. I really wish we could put this whole sort of Pandora back in the box. I know it's not going there anytime soon. It's like social media. It's one of these things. It's just going to kind of like pervade the environment. It's going to give us, people like Mark Zuckerberg and other kind of monstrous characters that eventually we'll be able to maybe flush out of our collective consciousness, but sadly not in the next year or so.
Hmm. So talking about briefly just about emotion, you mentioned fear, and fear. A person will feel fear when they have no plan. Do I have that right?
You have
If
that
some if
100% correct. Yeah.
Can you give me an example of that? For example, I know when I don't have a plan, if I want to do something, let's say I'm going somewhere, and I suddenly realize, man, I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't even know what I'm supposed to bring. I will feel frustrated, but not fear. Are you talking about something else?
No, no, no. So let's talk about your example in a second because I think I can explain to you why you might feel frustrated. But the way this comes again is from studying special operators under battlefield conditions. And so the first thing that happens when you get into a battlefield situation is a bomb will go off, bullets will start coming, and you will realize I don't know what to do, right? I don't know where the bullets are coming from. I don't know who's shooting at me. I don't know what my next step is. And your brain becomes overwhelmed with fear. And that fear paralyzes you and basically plants you still in your place. And the question is like, why is fear the signal that your brain developed to tell you that you don't have a plan? And the reason is your brain has a bias to action. Your
Mhm.
brain always wants to be acting. That's how it stays alive. When your brain sits still, right, when it freezes, it gets eaten. So it always wants to be moving. And when it doesn't have a plan, what it wants to do is it wants to take a plan from somewhere else. And fear allows you to do that because the more scared you get, the more susceptible you get to outside influence. If you go
Mhm.
up to a soldier on the battlefield who's freaking out and you tap him on the shoulder and say, "Hey, buddy, why don't you go this way?" They'll just do that, right? If you see a child who's scared, right, and you give them a piece of advice, that's called herd behavior. So fear makes your brain susceptible to this outside influence. And that's why it's both the signal and the result of you not having a plan. What you're talking
Mhm.
about in terms of going to a party and realizing that something is wrong and you're getting frustrated or irritated, you're actually having an anger response there. And because what's happening there is your brain is saying, I've got to go to the party. I just don't know where to go or what to bring, right? So
Mhm.
you've actually got one plan, which is get to the party. But you're unable to come up with another plan, which is go to the party with this item. You know what I mean? Or take a detour over to my friend's house and pick this thing up to go over. Do you see what I mean? So
Hmm.
anytime your brain starts to feel irritated, angry, or aggressive, what that's the signal is like, hey, you're locked in on a particular path of action. That's what you're trying to force it.
Hmm.
That's where irritation comes from. And so that's basically you having one plan as opposed to having flexibility. And again, we see this with operators in the battlefield is the more that their plans collapse,
Hmm.
the more aggressive they get. Until finally, if they're left with only one plan, it's just like boom, right, I'm going right for your neck. And so that's where all this research comes from. And once you start to kind of apply it to your own life, you'll start to see that it generally works. I mean, people's terminology is sometimes a little bit different, but the underlying psychological phenomena is usually pretty similar.
Hmm. And Angus, what about the emotion of optimism? What does optimism mean? What is it to be optimistic?
Yeah, so this is a particular hobby horse of mine because I feel like optimism is totally misunderstood by the modern world. So in the modern world, generally optimism is understood as the belief that this will happen or this will work. And this is linked with all sorts of weird things like manifesting, if you just like visualize success. And there's a whole tradition going back in America to something called New Thought, which emerged in the 19th century, which is basically a kind of magical thinking, which is essentially prayer. Like if I pray for something to happen, and if I pray with a pure heart, then it'll occur. And that is not optimism. That is delusion. I mean, no matter how much time you spend manifesting or praying, something is not going to happen. What optimism is the belief, instead of being the belief that this will happen, optimism is the belief that this can happen. And what we find in special operators is they have huge amounts of optimism. They're always believing that there's a possibility that something might work. And where optimism comes from is it comes from your past, as we were talking about earlier, and it comes from your memory of times when you tried things and surprisingly they worked.
Hmm.
And so special operators have this catalog of memories in their brain where they're like, you know what? I didn't think that other thing was going to work, but it did. So you know what? Maybe if I take a chance, it could work again. And the more you get in that kind of optimism cycle of this could work, this could work, this could work, first of all, it keeps you moving because you never give up, you never quit. But second of all, when something doesn't work, you're not like, oh, you know what? I'm such an idiot for trying it because, you never thought that it was guaranteed to work. Instead, you're like, you know what? It didn't work. I thought it could work. It didn't work. Let's move on to the next one. And so it just allows you to maintain this constant initiative. And initiative is the key to life.
Hmm.
That's what drives innovation. That's what drives leadership. That's what drives your ability to influence your environment.
So somebody like, somebody like a self-help guru who's telling you, oh, always be optimistic. Just think about it, and it's going to happen. You don't agree with that.
I do not agree with that at all. No, and I think, I mean, unfortunately, like there's been a lot of study on self-help. And, I will say my book actually got classified as self-help, much to like the horror of my editor. I was okay with it because I feel like if it finds its way into the people who are reading other self-help books, maybe it will help them. But, the problem with self-help people know is that it actually makes you dependent on self-help. The more you read one self-help book, the more you are likely to read 20 self-help books because they're affirming, and the term that we would use in the modern world is they're enabling. Like
Hmm.
if you have like a sort of an unhealthy relationship with a friend where you're constantly keep encouraging them to do things that are unhealthy for themselves because it makes them feel better about themselves. You don't want to sort of challenge them and tell them actually, hey. And what we find, particularly now, is a lot of people are sort of casually getting into therapy, misunderstanding the purpose of therapy. We're often told, oh, therapy is about affirming people. No, therapy is about helping you grow.
Hmm.
And being helped to grow means that you have to be challenged in moments. And if you're doing things that are dysfunctional or destructive, you need to be challenged by your therapist. And it's the same thing with optimism. Optimism is not there to make you imagine there's a magic world where all of your desires are going to be fulfilled if you just wish hard enough and you're just a nice enough person, right? Optimism is there just to keep you moving long enough that you can start to learn. And a big way that you start to learn is you realize how, you're not perfect. There are ways that you can improve. And so I'm very against self-help gurus who essentially make money by pandering to people.
Hmm. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. Well, talking about common sense, going back to logic again, is there a difference between logic and common sense?
Yes, they're totally different. And we know that they're totally different because computers do not have common sense. This is a
Hmm.
famous problem in computer science. And that's because common sense, as I discussed in detail in the book, is actually a narrative function.
Hmm.
It's your ability to measure the volatility of your environment. That's where common sense comes from. And
Hmm.
you're able to measure the volatility of your environment by determining how many whys and what ifs essentially are being generated in your brain. And
Hmm.
more whys and more what ifs are telling you there's more unknown unknowns. Computers cannot detect unknown unknowns. Computers can be programmed to detect known unknowns, but only the human brain can detect unknown unknowns. Why? Because of this power of common sense. And what common sense does by helping you measure the volatility of your environment, it helps tell you when you want to do the obvious thing because volatility is low, and when you need to get out of your comfort zone and take a risk because volatility is high. So a computer will never have common sense. Common sense and logic are totally different. Logic is probabilistic, and common sense is built to handle novel situations of which there are no statistical patterns because they have an n of exactly one.
Mhm. Can a computer lie? Will it lie to you? You know, nowadays or in the last while, I've heard a few people saying, well, it's ChatGPT has advanced so much that it's actually lying to me now. It's telling me lies. Is that true?
AI tells you what you want to hear.
Hmm.
So the more that you are lying to yourself, the more that ChatGPT is also going to lie to you. So, if you, for example, tell yourself that ChatGPT is intelligent and can help me, then it's going to give it a whole wide realm of ability to lie to you because it's going to do everything it can to convince you that it's intelligent and that it's trying to help you. The truth is that computers don't understand lying in the way that we understand lying because from a computer's perspective, everything that it knows is essentially true. That's the map of the problem. That's the map of truth. So whenever a computer tells you something, it's telling you what it thinks is the truth. It is
Hmm.
just unable to determine the limits of its own knowledge. Also, computers have no motive for lying because computers have no motive for anything. They lack motives entirely. It's a completely passive system. This is another fundamental difference between computers and humans. Our intelligence is entirely active. We're trying things and then learning through this process. Whereas computers just sit there, absorb information, and find patterns in it. So computers can be unintentionally deceptive. Computers can hallucinate. Computers can tell you things which are untrue. But at the end of the day, they don't lie. They have no motive to lie. They don't understand lying in the way that we do. So that's just kind of like anthropomorphizing something,
Hmm.
which is just a bunch of metal.
Hmm. Last question, Angus. Where does anxiety come in relation to common sense? Why do you connect anxiety to common sense?
Anxiety is the driver of common sense. And I realized this through working with military units because they were always talking about tuning their anxiety.
Hmm.
And what they meant by that was they meant that if you're in a situation which is a fast moving, novel situation, you want your spidey sense to go active. You want to all of a sudden feel anxious because things are changing around you. If you're in a very boring situation where nothing is interesting, you want your anxiety to essentially be at zero. So you want your level of anxiety to match the level of your environment. And civilians generally don't do this. Civilians get incredibly anxious in incredibly boring situations. So they'll go to the supermarket and then they'll want to buy something and it won't be there, and then they'll just freak out and get like totally, stressed and anxious about what's going to happen when they don't have their thing and so on and so forth. And so, as a civilian, your anxiety is mistuned. And the goal of that chapter of the book is to help you tune your anxiety. And it's showing you the more you tune your anxiety, the more your common sense will increase. Because
Hmm.
instead of freaking out over little things and then not reacting fast enough to big things, which is what people with high anxiety do. In other words, they're always overreacting to small things, then underreacting to big things because they get paralyzed. Instead, when your anxiety is at the right level, you will react quickly and aggressively to big things and ignore small things. And so that's how, on a physiological level, anxiety is driving common sense. And computers obviously cannot be anxious, which is yet another reason why computers cannot have common sense.
Hmm. You know, a lot of people nowadays are very anxious. They're experiencing anxiety about AI. You know, AI taking jobs, AI replacing them, and there are a lot of people in that situation. What would you say to those people? What would you say? Should they feel that anxiety? Should they use their common sense to overstep it? What would you say to them?
Yeah. So first of all, AI is not going to replace you. AI is not that useful. AI, particularly these chatbots and these LLMs, is largely a hoax. It's going to pass. They are not capable of solving most of the tasks or being agentic or doing any of these kinds of things that we're being told by these software companies, most of whom are, I think, starting to admit. that this is a fraud and that we are living in the middle of a bubble. The deeper problem is, however, the fact that people are so obsessed with AI shows you the loss of confidence people have in their own intelligence.
Mhm.
We're living at this moment where people feel so overwhelmed that they can't solve things. They're like, oh, you know what? I need something else to help me. That's not going to work. That will be the end of the human race. The moment where we give up on solving our own problems, it's over for us. And so the deeper thing there is we have to start collectively owning more of the problems that we're creating and coming up with new answers to them because we're the only ones that are going to make the future.
Do you think there's a danger of us not doing that, though, Angus? Do you think that I can see a large proportion of the population relying on AI and getting sucked into it even more? I don't see too many people coming to that realization that you just voiced.
So here's the thing. When I first wrote this book 2 years ago, I wanted the subtitle to be "You Are Smarter Than AI." And my
Mhm.
editor said to me, nobody cares about AI, Angus. There's no point in having that as the subtitle. Bizarrely, the moment the book was published, all people were talking about was AI. And so what that's telling you is that just because of the community I've been living in, I'm sort of on the leading edge of this phenomenon. And so in the same way that I saw 2 years ago that AI was going to be big now, I can say with some confidence that 2 years from now, people are going to have realized that AI is not going to be that big a deal. So I'm not that concerned about people waking up to AI. I'm more concerned by the fact that people are so willing to turn over their autonomy to it. And that you
Mhm.
see like this real sense of desperation and panic in people that they're just so overwhelmed that they're giving up and they want something else to somehow solve all their problems. And going back to what you were talking about with Nietzsche earlier, I mean, one thing that I can really agree with on Nietzsche is you've got to seize the opportunity.
Mhm.
You've got to step up and will to power a little bit, You've got to own the situation and find that strength within. And I think, we're living in a world where people are becoming increasingly passive because of technology use, and they need to get back their primordial strength, their desire for hard things, their realization that hard things produce growth, which is the source of almost all the joy and satisfaction in life, and just stop looking for easy answers and other things to fix it for us.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic advice, Angus. Angus, where can people find your where can people find you?
Well, the book Primal Intelligence is now a bestseller, so you can just probably Google Primal Intelligence. It's probably in an airport near you. You've probably already seen too much of it. And they can find me if you want just by Googling Angus in Ohio. I think I'm pretty much the only Angus in Ohio.
Great. I will have all your links in the description of this video. So if you want to go down below, you will see all of Angus's links and where to find them. Angus, thank you.
It's been a huge pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you very much.